This is a book about how we think, and how we can help leaders think differently in service of navigating the complexities of contemporary life. The need to think differently is often couched in terms of the need to think systemically. What do we mean, though, when we talk about the need to think systemically? There are hundreds of different systems theories, many of them hard to understand and to apply to our lives as leaders. In this book, we condense those hundreds of theories to 5 broad categories. We look at leadership, leadership development, and coaching through each of those 5 lenses. In this short video, we'll seek to capture the essence of each of those 5 approaches with reference to COVID-19 and talk about leadership. Let's first look at the linear systemic perspective. Looking through a linear systemic lens, we assume a simple linear logical relationship between factors. A plus B leads to C. We saw this way of thinking show up in the way some leaders talked about COVID, particularly early on. For example, a quote from a global leader in July 2020. "We're now seeing a warning light on the dashboard. Our assessment is that we should now squeeze that brake pedal in order to keep the virus under control." This statement implies a simple linear relationship between the causes of COVID and rates of transmission. Identify what those causes are, and you can take steps to control the spread of the virus. We call this a linear systemic perspective, and we heard it from a number of leaders at the beginning of the pandemic. This way of thinking, when faced with the first few cases of COVID, assumed that the worst case scenario would be a slow, steady increase in infections. A few simple interventions could halt the spread of the virus, which was regarded as being controllable. This way of thinking often serves us well, particularly when faced with simple issues. If someone pokes me in the eye with a stick, it hurts. If they don't poke me in the eye with a stick, it doesn't hurt. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it may well be a duck. Leaders thinking in this way likely regard organisations as systems. They see themselves being able to step outside their organisation to diagnose what needs to be changed. They believe they can control change. Now, the non-linear systemic. A non-linear systemic perspective recognises the existence of positive feedback loops, reinforcing relationships between variables that lead to exponential change. The relationship between variables is not linear. During COVID, we witnessed this way of thinking among leaders who recognised that 10 cases of COVID today could quickly become 10,000 cases. Indeed, 10 cases of COVID today might mean that 10,000 people were already infected. These leaders didn't advocate for simple solutions. They spoke publicly about the need to better understand how the virus worked and called on subject matter experts to advise them what to do. The emphasis was still on control, but these leaders recognised that the virus could only be controlled if the situation was acknowledged to be complicated and if the temptation to come up with quick, albeit logical conclusions was resisted. Leaders thinking in this way still regard organisations as systems, but those systems are complicated and the leader spends time unravelling difficult problems. One barrier to this way of thinking is time. Leaders feel pressured to make decisions quickly. Now let's look at the collaborative systemic. This is the frog lens. Gregory Bateson, well-known social scientist and anthropologist, got excited when he discovered that frogs can only see things that move. If it doesn't move, frogs can't see it, isn't real. Bateson realised that we humans are the same. We see what we notice and assume that what we notice is reality. But we all notice different things and then argue with each other about what is true. This leader knows that none of us are capable of witnessing events objectively, that we see everything through a lens that directs us to pay attention to some aspects of a situation and not to others. The leader thinking in this way genuinely seeks out the opinions of others, not just subject matter experts. This leader sought out the views of others, including people living in countries where COVID struck earlier, or countries such as Canada and some Asian countries where SARS was most devastating. These leaders seek as many informed perspectives as possible in their efforts to construct the best hypothesis they can. Leaders thinking in this way still regard organisations as systems, but these systems are so complex and people cannot experience those systems objectively that you just have to seek out multiple perspectives. The more perspectives you elicit, the more likely your hypothesis as to how the system operates is likely to be true. One barrier to this way of thinking is a value around intelligence. Leaders believe they should be clever enough to work out solutions by themselves. The complex systemic way of thinking recognises that leaders cannot control outcomes. This leader recognises that change emerges from all the different social interactions taking place across an organisation, but she knows she can influence outcomes by engaging effectively in those social interactions. This leader is deeply curious to understand what sense people are making of events and constantly wondering where best to invest her energies in conversation and discussion with others. When this political leader was faced with people flocking to the beach on a COVID summer's day, she didn't focus exclusively on reinforcing existing measures. This leader also wanted to understand the perspectives of people who were clearly not aligned with government policy. Leaders thinking in this way regard organisations as complex systems. Change is constant and emerges from local conversations taking place across the organisation. The leader cannot control outcomes but can influence. Leaders must engage if they are to influence. One barrier to this way of thinking is a value around control. Leaders believe they should be able to control outcomes. The idea that change emerges and can only be influenced is unacceptable. So far, all these perspectives may be said to be systemic. The meta-systemic approach challenges the ideas that we can usefully compare the functioning of organisations with systems at all. People don't behave like the cogs in a machine. They're conscious and choiceful and ultimately unpredictable. The meta-systemic leader recognises the limitations of the system's metaphor, including the idea that people behave logically and predictably, the idea that there exist real boundaries that define teams, functions, and organisations. It may therefore cause us to underestimate the role that people outside the organisation have on events inside the organisation. During COVID, this leader recognised the significance of national boundaries in the opportunities they offered to restrict the movement of COVID. This leader also recognised that boundaries are not impermeable structures. Boundaries are areas of physical space policed by people. And people behave unpredictably. This leader knows that no country is an island. COVID variants, for example, in one country inevitably impact the spread of COVID elsewhere. Vaccination strategies must be coordinated if the global economy is to recover as quickly as possible. This leader consults, engages and listens, but directs those energies as much outside the system as inside the system. This leader sees the necessity of a coordinated global response. Leaders thinking in this way recognise that organisations are not systems. Organisations aren't even real. Teams, functions and organisations are all mental constructs we refer to in service of making life simple to understand. This leader is able to think outside these imaginary boundaries in working out who is influencing what. This leader knows that conflict is good and that innovation and agility and adaptability all depend on people being able to share different ideas. One barrier to this way of thinking is about being over-attached to the idea of boundaries. These are the 5 ways of thinking about systems. We don't say one is better than the others. Rather, we encourage leaders to think about how they're thinking and to make conscious choices about how they approach complex issues. So if you'd like to know more, please visit our website or buy the book. Thank you very much for listening.